So now I just would like to welcome Dr. David Best, who's the Professor of Criminology in the Department of Law and Criminology in Sheffield, Hallam University, and Visiting Associate Professor of Addiction Studies in Monash University in Melbourne. So we're delighted that you could join us, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I split my time between Australia and England and America. So you'll see in the slides all come from what is the Recovery Outcomes Institute, which is based in Florida. And I spend part of my time there. And this work is now work that is taken off significantly. And I'll come on to this a little bit. I'm just waiting for my slides to appear, and then I will be ready to go. So I'll just kind of start with a little bit of background. What I intend to cover over the course of this session is what sounds like a bizarre title for my presentation, and thank you very much for that, which is Ink Spots and Ice Cream Cones, because really what I'm going to argue is about where I think the evidence and the theory is for models of recovery. And I'm glad there was that discussion of communities, because one of the big transitions from a traditional treatment model to a recovery model is the locus of where recovery happens. It doesn't happen in specialist clinics. It happens in families and it happens in communities. And that move from traditional treatment to recovery is also associated with a switch from a deficits-based model to a strengths-based model. It's a positive model for change. And I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of background around this. So next slide, please. And I'm afraid to say I have lots and lots of slides, so there is definitely a lot that I'm going to be kind of saying. So sorry, Carl, your finger will be getting very tired in the course of this presentation. Perfect. So some basic information about what we know about addiction recovery. Of all the people who have a lifetime substance use disorder, I've never had a musical accompaniment to one of my talks before. I'm quite happy with that. Of all the people who have had a lifetime substance use disorder, we know that 58% will eventually achieve stable recovery, which means 5 years of continuous sobriety. And that's a summary of evidence that was published by Sheedy and Witter for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in 2009. I guess that's a sort of statistic where you can read as either glass half full or glass half empty. But from my point of view, what it means is over 50% of people will recover. And one of the challenges for the recovery movement is how do we push that percentage higher? Because the flip side is 42% of people with a lifetime substance addiction die addicted. And that seems to me something that we can do significantly better with. We also know that when somebody detoxes or stops themselves, the likelihood that they'll relapse in the next year is between 50 and 70%. Most people relapse in the first year. But if they get to 5 years, their likelihood of relapse drops to around 14%. And so in essence, if you think, what is the point of a recovery movement and a recovery initiative? It's to get people through to that 5-year point of stable recovery. This is a crucial thing. Now, we know also from the same body of work from Mike Dennis and his colleagues in the United States that the typical addiction career lasts around 28 years and typically involves 4 to 5 episodes of treatment over 8 years in time, followed by that 5-year window. So people will typically start using in their early teens or pre-teen years. They'll first experience dependence issues around 20 or 21. They will then first attempt to stop in their mid-20s. They'll then go through a sequence of in and out of specialist help over 7 or 8 years, and then they'll have 5 years, typically from around their mid-30s to around the age of 40. Why am I telling you this? Because there should be no more of this false dichotomy of recovery and harm reduction. People will need a whole range of interventions in the course of that 28 years. Prevention, early intervention, needle exchanges, opiate substitution treatments, none of which is inconsistent with the fact that many people will come out the other end and will be looking for long-term stable abstinence at the end of that journey. And ultimately, for me, the evidence is really clear What gets people to stop is typically because they're sick of the lifestyle and then something bad happens. They lose their house, they lose their job, they have a health crisis. But what gets people to stay stopped isn't the same. What gets people to stay stopped is spending time with other people in recovery, moving away from using networks into sober networks. And my work over the last decade has basically really focused on the right-hand side of this slide. What enables people, what enables organizations to support recovery journeys? And there's a wonderful model that we've stolen from the mental health recovery movement, which is called CHIME. And CHIME is really a summary of what works and what you can do to support other people's recovery. And CHIME stands for connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And it's not quite in the right order because essentially it starts with human connection, positive social connection, the role models who are seen to have done the same thing, generates the belief that change is possible, hope. And that hope generates the energy and motivation for a virtuous circle of meaningful activities, empowerment, and a positive sense of identity. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is about that cycle of that virtuous circle that can be initiated. Our next slide, please. And I'm going to say something else that I think is a big change from traditional clinical models. I had a medical student who worked with me when I worked at the University of Birmingham. And she was doing an intercalating degree and she was interested in recovery. And I sent her out to interview 50 people in long-term alcohol recovery. And we used the World Health Organization Brief Quality of Life Scale, which is called the WHO. And what we did was she collected this data and then we compared it against population norms for people who'd never been addicted in the first place. What did that tell us? What that told us was that people who are in long-term recovery not only return to normal levels, if you like, of well-being and quality of life, they actually exceed what the general members of the population have. And this term, we reported this for drinkers in Birmingham. Phil Valentine reported the same effect for stimulant users in the United States and Connecticut. And what he coined the term better than well. Recovery is not about going back to where you started from, because where you started from generally wasn't a particularly good place. Recovery is an ongoing journey of growth and change and well-being, better than well. Recovery is not simply about the elimination or amelioration of symptoms. And that's crucial for how we conceptualize and frame recovery journeys. And I'll continue that point in the next slide, please, where on the right-hand side of this slide, we did the first UK Life and Recovery Survey in 2015. And what we found there was that basically of people in long-term recovery, roughly 80% of them actively volunteer and contribute to their communities. And I'm going to use that term community a lot in this presentation. And I was really interested and impressed by this. And so I went back and checked what the general rate of volunteering and community participation is. And it's about 39%. In other words, people in long-term recovery are twice as likely to be actively involved in their community as people who've never been addicted in the first place. The second symptom of better than well, but a particularly important one for crime reduction, because we know that active citizenship and active participation in communities is an ingredient of what we call collective efficacy. And collective efficacy, which is about communities doing stuff together, is regarded as the single biggest predictor in the global reductions in crime between 1991 and 2021. In other words, the greater community involvement is getting involved in things in your local area, the lower the likelihood the community is to have high rates of criminality. Okay, I'm now going to move on to a specific study. Next slide, please, called the RECPath study. I am just in the process of finalising and writing this study up, and this is a 3-year study of recovery pathways in Scotland, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands, funded by health departments in all of those countries. And what we did was there's a whole range of strands about understanding how people recover. And incidentally, we managed to get funding to continue this study through COVID. So I'll also say something about what impact COVID had on recovery. And our aim was to recruit roughly equal numbers of men and women, and roughly equal numbers of people at the start of the study who were in early recovery, first year, sustained recovery 1 to 5 years, and stable recovery more than 5 years at the start of the study. And for the first phase of the study, the life and recovery part, we recruited 1,340 people. For our long-term outcome data, we recruited 370. Anyway, and next slide, please, Carl. And what we basically found was, well, there's two things from this slide. The first is the vast majority of people don't simply use one mechanism to recover. They will use multiple. The study attempted to look at 5 different pathways: 12-step, other forms of peer-based recovery support that weren't 12-step based, residential treatment, community treatment, and other services. And as lots of European studies, we struggled to recruit what's called a natural recovery cohort, which is people who didn't go for any form of help at any point. They exist, we just always struggle to recruit them. But you'll notice that the first point to make from this is multiple pathways. So people use mutual aid, peer groups, and specialist treatments. It's unusual only to use one. The second thing is recovery is not the same country to country to country. And I've just finished doing a major piece of work in the Balkans, in Bosnia, Serbia, and it's linked to this project. And there's almost no mutual aid or peer-based support. And recovery looks fundamentally different. In other words, recovery is not just about the person. Recovery is partly about where it happens. How you can recover and the likelihood of you managing to recover is partly about what institutions, structures, and processes are in place wherever you are. And partly that's about stigma, exclusion, and jobs. Because if we don't think of this as treatment, but we think of this as about reintegration and well-being, it's about jobs, friends, and houses. And stigma is critical to that. I'm sorry, I'm going to go quickly, but there's quite a lot of things to say about this stuff. So next slide, please. The crucial finding for us was, over the first, so we recruited a cohort of people that we followed up multiple time points, and at every time point we got 313 people across those countries, which is a good study size for this. And in the first year of the study, we had a relapse rate of 10.4%, but slightly higher relapse among among men than among women. Well, actually nearly double as high. But what I wanted to bring to your attention is the 4th bullet point down there. Of the people who were 5 years or more into the recovery journey when we recruited them, 1.5% of them relapsed. For people who were between 1 and 5 years when we recruited them, 17% relapsed. For people in the first year of their recovery journey, 30%, 1 in 3 relapsed. There is almost a linear reduction. And if you are interested in meaningful recovery responses, focus on those people in early recovery because they are 20 times as likely to relapse as people who've got 5 years of continuous sobriety under their belts. The other thing that I wanted to say, and there's only been one previous study in America that's reported this, is people who attended both specialist treatment and mutual aid in their recovery journeys had significantly better outcomes than people who only went to specialist treatment or only went to mutual aid. We should stop this competition about it's either treatment or 12-step. People who did both did better. But there was still a slight bias in favour of if people had some form of peer-based recovery support in their journey, they did better in various areas, as the bottom bullet point shows. Okay, onwards. I'm going to talk now about an older study called the Goya Study. And Goya is an incredibly complicated and sophisticated research term. So this was a study where we looked at what were the predictors of recovery well-being in Birmingham and Glasgow. The part I'm going to talk about is actually from the Glasgow study. Alcoholics and heroin addicts in recovery. 2 things predicted recovery stability and recovery well-being. The more time you spent with other people in recovery, social contagion, the more time you spent doing stuff and engaging in meaningful activities. We just took a basic measure of how much stuff do you do. Now, you can impress all your friends and family this weekend with this incredibly sophisticated scientific term, Goya, which stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. And it didn't really matter what stuff you did, as long as it wasn't watching daytime television or playing on an iPad or whatever. If you engaged in any form of pro-social meaningful activity, your recovery outcomes were better. Next slide, please, Carl. So we showed this in Birmingham and Glasgow, and I got massively criticised for saying, how do you know it's not the case that people who had already had better well-being then did more stuff? So we then went to 3 English drug action team areas, and we split people, and we followed them over a year, and we split them into 4 groups. And what we did was we measured changes in meaningful activity. If you start meaningful activities, your quality of life and well-being goes up, physical health and psychological health. If you stop meaningful activities, your quality of life and well-being goes down. If you do meaningful activities all the way through, your well-being and quality of life is higher than people who don't do those things at any point. Meaningful activity triggers well-being and quality of life, not the other way around. This is as close to a causal effect as we can report. If people get off their arse and do things, they will do better. Next slide, please. So we did these studies in the UK. We now go 4,000 miles away, and every researcher has to produce some stupid pompous chart that means absolutely nothing to anyone. So this is mine. But this is a study we did with the Florida Association of Recovery Residences. And how you read this is called a structured equation model. You read it from the bottom left up. And the pathway across the bottom is typically how specialist residential services work. The longer time you spend in the residence, the less barriers there are to recovery, the less unmet needs you have, and the greater your overall well-being. Well, no surprise there. But there's also a Goya effect, a separate pathway. That if you spend that time in residences and engage in meaningful activities, which is going up the way, you will report more personal recovery capital and more social recovery capital, and it adds an extra layer of boost onto your overall well-being. In other words, whether we talk Birmingham, Glasgow, or South Florida, we got exactly the same effect. Social connection plus meaningful activities leads to better well-being and quality of life. Brilliant. All right, onwards. And what we've started to do is to develop a model of what you do with people that builds that recovery. And there's something clever. So I'm going to start talking about capital now, social capital and recovery capital. Recovery capital consists of 3 things: personal, social, and community capital. And the ultimate aim is to build people's personal recovery capital. But you do that through social identity work and asset-based community engagement. And what happens is it's a drop-down effect. Personal well-being, self-esteem, self-efficacy, coping skills, resilience skills are built through social processes. Engagement in communities, engagement in pro-social groups. But what we find is that there's also the sprinkles on top of the ice cream. And you can tell why I'm so fat, because every analogy I use is food-related. But the sprinkles on top of the ice cream are, the more of that stuff you do, it's not just the individuals who benefit, the community itself benefits from that process of active social engagement, of creating what we call weak ties. The more connections there are, I already mentioned it in terms of crime reduction and collective efficacy. But here what we have is community capital grows. And my academic mentor, who's a man called John Braithwaite from Australian National University, will say, financial capital and social capital are different. If you have financial capital and you use it, you have less of it afterwards, as sadly all of our bank managers know. But if you have community capital and social capital and you use it, there is more of it left at the end than the start. And I'm just really conscious I'm now talking too much and running late. So quick, Carl, I'll blame you for moving the slides too slow. And what's more is, the other point from a recovery perspective is that this is called ink spots and ice cream. This is the model of how crime reduces. And I would suggest to anyone, go onto the Australian National University website, download a book called Macrocriminology by John Braithwaite, and this will talk to you about the same model for crime reduction. If you get successful community models and projects, do not try and replicate them. Don't try and McDonaldize it and transplant it to somewhere else. The model of ink spots and ice cream is you take your successful initiatives and you link them up to other successful initiatives. You don't try to copy them. You learn and share. You try and create social contagion. We're not doing fast food. Just because a recovery cafe works in one place doesn't mean it will work in another. You have to learn that growth process over time. And so I'm one of the founders of something called the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations in the UK, which is exactly an attempt to create the ink spots and ice cream model. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to talk more about the idea of recovery capital. Next slide again, please. Oh, I like the way they go different directions. That's a good thing. The idea of recovery capital is like, so instead of thinking about just getting rid of bad things in your life, bloodborne viruses, physical health problems, psychological distress, Granfield and Cloud came up with this wonderful term, and they actually first talked about it in 1993. And as they where are you in your recovery journey is the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain alcohol and other drug problems. And one of those people, William Cloud, along with the great William White, argued, and this is really important in the history of where we're going, but stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of recovery assets, not pathologies. In other words, you predict who will do well, not on their dual diagnosis of their physical health problems, but what assets they have, what social supports they have, what personal skills and competences they have, what connections and resources are available to them in their community for them to draw upon. That predicts long-term recovery better than any of our traditional measures of illness and pathology. Next slide, please, Carl. And we're back to food and we're into pies. So this pie is something that myself and Alexandra Lodi drew up for the Royal Society for the Arts in 2010. Yeah, 2010. And I just want to reiterate that point. So the three slices of pie are dynamically linked. And ultimately, the aim is to make recovery self-sustaining, a term used by Michael Dennis at the 5-year point. And what that means is people have to have enough coping skills, resilience, self-esteem, self-efficacy, positive communication skills. But you do that through the other two slices of pie. Through positive social connections and the social identification and belonging that comes there, and through the assets in your community, visible recovery resources, houses, jobs, they are the things that sustain and enable recovery to change. And just, can we move forward, please, Carl? The great kind of boost for my work in the last year or so is that you will see that for the first time in the Biden-Harris address at the start of, actually it was the start of 2021. At the start of 2021, they talked about recovery capital for the first time as a key component. And now in the US, unlike in England, there's a fixed percentage of drug spend has to go in recovery services. And so this model has now really prompted a significant rise in recovery capital science and research. And this is boosted. So the work that I'm about to talk about, where I'm doing some work on this, is now taking place in Michigan, Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. So next slide, please. The model for me is not about simply counting. We can use recovery capital as a mechanism for counting, but it should be a modular approach, a model of the measurement of recovery capital generates recovery care planning, which in turn generates activation and active engagement in community resources and community assets. And the third and final section of my talk, in the last 7 minutes available to me, I'm going to try and talk about this. But it is quantifiable. And the big thing about recovery capital is it moves all that vague language of what do we mean by recovery? Is it something subjective and personal and all that kind of thing into something that's much more countable and measurable. And Emily Hennessy and myself have written a paper on addiction that's coming out this month that's about saying where are we going with the future directions of this recovery capital work. Next slide, please. Sorry, if we can just pop along. So these are some of the dimensions that we measure with recovery capital. So moving into, yeah, perfect. Moving into the next component part. Group belonging matters. Group belonging matters not just because we know that the more actively you're engaged in recovery groups, the better you do, but also the more time you spend in a group and the more actively involved in a group you are, it shapes your beliefs, values, perceptions, and attitudes. And when you're in a risk situation, it changes what's called availability and set. In other words, the responses you have are partly determined by valued group membership. So changing the groups people are in doesn't just change whether people approve or disapprove of your drug use. It changes your values and your relationship to drugs. And in the paper that we mentioned here, one of the core things was about how do we support and enable that group process of change. Next slide, please. So we started doing this with residential treatment services in Victoria and Australia. And basically what we did was we got people to map out the social networks they engaged, and then we got to color code them. So we basically color coded their social networks according to where the active problem users in red, occasional users, non-users are in recovery. And when we first did this with 6 people at an Aboriginal health centre in the north of Victoria, an Aboriginal residential service in the north of Victoria, what we found was it was an astonishing penny dropping moment when they started to realise that if I want to seriously change my recovery journey, I have to do something about those red dots, because if I don't do something about that, I'm not going to, I will be slipping back into those networks. And what we also showed, because the lines between the social networks are really about congruence or conflict between groups, and that was really important for us. And it changed my view on this stuff from being about measurement to this actually being a form of intervention. So social networks matter, but the next part and the final part I'm going to talk about are socio-societal ones. Next slide, please. For me, the core of this is how do we identify and engage community resources in different bundles of community resources. And it's crucial that as recovery-oriented services, we have mechanisms for the effective engagement with community resources, because that is the community capital you want to drop on. Next slide, please. And we need to have the key to the success of this, and this is a million miles from treatment land, is that you have people who are the human bridges and connectors into those resources. And we actually trained in a Category D open prison in the north of England. We trained family members to be community connectors prior to people getting out of jail, to allow them to engage effectively with community resources. And, you know, everybody needs some form of engagement, but people who are low in community capital or social capital can be divided into 2 groups. Those who are socially isolated and excluded, and those whose networks are damaging and detrimental to their recovery. For them, assertive linkage and community engagement is crucially important. Next slide, please. And we got some money when I worked in Sheffield, which I don't do anymore, incidentally, from the Health Foundation to look at how we do some of this work. And we did this across Sheffield, and what we did was we recruited a group of people who were in long-term recovery. We trained them up to be community connectors. What we got them to do was to identify assets across Sheffield. The next slide, please. In 4 categories: mutual aid groups, recreation and sport, volunteering, education, employment, and peer and recovery community groups. Next slide, please. I'm pleased to know I am very nearly finished. We recruited 21 of them. They successfully identified, but not just a directory, they opened the doors at 134 different assets across Sheffield. And this was the key mechanism to effective engagement. Now, this process, will we get the presentation? Yes, from my point of view, I'd be delighted for anyone to get the presentation, because I realise I've run through this far too quick. And the aim of this is to help people build personal capital via positive community connections and social group belonging. The model of this is to say, how do you link people who are lacking in recovery capital to build it? You do it through positive social networks and active engagement in multiple pro-social activities. Last slide, and I'll give you second last slide, and I'll give you an example of this from when I used to work many years ago. Sorry, can we move on to the next slide? Sorry. Yeah, perfect. I used to work I did a lot of my training in a large teaching hospital in London called the Maudsley Hospital, and I worked at the Institute of Psychiatry next door. The acute assessment unit was an emergency admissions ward for heroin, crack, and alcohol. And we took 153 people. We randomly assigned them to 3 conditions. They either got, so the aim of the study was to say, could we get these emergency admission people to attend at least one Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, or Cocaine Anonymous meeting while they were on the ward? And we either gave them a leaflet, or the booking-in doctor encouraged them to attend, or a peer came and talked to them beforehand, took them to a meeting, and took them for a coffee afterwards and talked to them about what happened. In the assertive linkage, the peer condition, where somebody who you trust and respect and value takes you, we got more meeting attendance when they were on the ward. We got more meeting attendance in the 3 months post-departure, because we got some research money to follow up. And we got reduced substance use in the 3 months afterwards. Now, for me, it doesn't matter whether this is Alcoholics Anonymous or a Zumba class or a football club or a library attendance. This is about pro-social meaningful activity, and the more different things, the better. Apologies to any doctors in the room, but there are 2 crucial lessons to this study. Three crucial lessons to this study. Number 1, giving people leaflets is a pointless abuse of dead trees. Number 2, booking in doctors are only marginally more useful than dead trees. Number 3, peers who can do that assertive continuity of support and care lead to clear benefits and changes over time. So, very quick conclusions in my probably not last 30 seconds are that 1, recovery is something that builds gradually over time. To do it requires changes in social networks. To do that requires effective and assertive engagement in community resources and groups. If I've been doing this talk even 5 years ago, and I've had to say the literature around recovery is weak, but the recovery literature is now strong, and recovery capital gives us a measurement metric that is incredibly powerful. Sadly, I'm not going to be able to join you for your discussion session at the end. But if people want to write to Dermot or any of the organisers, he will pass on my email address, and I'll happily respond to messages in due course. So I'm delighted to have joined you. I'm sorry to have done that at such appallingly breakneck speed. I'm happy for anyone to have my slides. And if anyone wants to follow up with me, please just get in touch with me. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, David. That was wonderful. It was a bit of a breakneck speed, so I'm sure it'll take a while to digest all that information. And I suppose for me in particular, given that the topic of today is communities in recovery, one piece that really struck out for me was that, you emphasized quite a bit the individual and what they need to do in order to be in recovery, and obviously the importance of connectedness and social networking. And I suppose for me, one of the things that really hit me was that little thing with the red spots. Visuals are always very impactful, and I just thought to myself, we really need to make sure that communities that are not the red spot problem. And I suppose for me, one of the things that we need to think about more today and into the future is not just the individual's responsibility for that recovery, but there's no point in connecting to a community which isn't also in recovery process itself. And I love the fact that you broadened it out to include things like housing and jobs and just the whole, I suppose in a way, what I was jotting down to myself was that communities have responsibilities to people in the community in the same way that individuals in the community have responsibility to their community. But on top of all of that, the state also has responsibility to communities as well, to make them places that aren't going to be red spots for people trying to recover. So there's a lot for us to think about there, David. Thank you very much.